There is a version of World War I that most people carry around in their heads without ever questioning it. It involves mud and heroism, and the tragedy of young men cut down before their time. It involves poets writing in candlelight, and officers with polished buttons and generals making impossible decisions. It involves a beginning, a middle, and an end. It involves meaning. That version is largely a construction. It was built during the war itself, maintained afterward by governments that needed the dead to have died for something, and preserved by a culture that found the alternative too uncomfortable to hold for very long. The alternative is this: a war that was not primarily about heroism or sacrifice or even ideology, but about the mechanical processing of human beings through an industrial system that had been designed, whether anyone admitted it or not, to consume them. What soldiers actually learned to live with during those 4 years was not the noble weight of duty. It was something far more specific, far more physical, and far more corrosive to every idea they had carried into the war with them. The men who entered the trenches in 1914 and 1915 did not immediately understand what they had entered. Most of them had been told, directly or by implication, that the war would be short. The machinery of recruitment leaned heavily on urgency. There were posters, speeches, the social pressure of neighborhoods and workplaces and families. There was the suggestion, sometimes explicit and sometimes just hanging in the air, that if a man did not go now, there might not be anything left worth going for. The early volunteers on the British side, the men of Kitchener's army, came from every level of society. They came from factories and offices and farms and universities. They brought with them the assumptions of their world, the belief that physical courage was a thing that mattered, that institutions were fundamentally trustworthy, that war, however terrible, had a shape. Within months, most of those assumptions had been stripped away. What replaced them was not nihilism exactly, and not despair exactly, but something harder to name, a kind of flat realism. A recognition that the world they had entered operated by different rules, and that the only way to survive in it, psychologically and physically, was to learn those rules and stop expecting them to resemble anything from before. The first and most immediate thing soldiers had to learn to live with was the smell. This sounds almost trivial stated plainly, but the olfactory reality of the Western Front was one of the most consistently documented aspects of the experience, described again and again in letters and diaries and memoirs with a specificity that suggests it was not something men ever quite got used to, even when they stopped consciously registering it. The trenches smelled of mud, which sounds straightforward until you understand what that mud contained. The soil of Flanders and northeastern France had been turned over and over by shellfire, mixed with the waste products of hundreds of thousands of men, with the decomposing bodies of the dead, with chloride of lime that was applied in quantities to suppress infection, and which itself had a sharp chemical smell that mixed with everything else. There was the smell of cordite from artillery shells, which was acrid and slightly sweet and settled in the back of the throat. There was the smell of unwashed bodies, of uniforms that had never been properly cleaned and that carried sweat and grease and the particular odor of men under extreme stress. There was the smell of latrines, which in many sections of the line were simply holes in the ground at the end of a traverse, screened by a piece of canvas if the men were lucky, and which in wet weather overflowed. There was, in summer especially, the smell of the dead. The dead in no man's land could not always be retrieved. They lay where they had fallen, sometimes for weeks, and decomposed in full view of men who had to look across that ground every day. The process of decomposition in warm weather is rapid and specific in its stages, and men who had spent any length of time at the front could describe those stages from direct observation. What is striking in the accounts is not the horror, but the matter-of-factness. By a certain point, the smell was simply part of the environment, the way the smell of a factory floor or a farm becomes part of the environment. The men had not become callous. They had become adapted, which is a different thing, and the difference between those two words is something the war forced them to understand. The mud was not simply a background condition. It was an active presence, something that moved and trapped and killed in ways that had no precedent in previous military experience. The clay of Flanders, particularly around the Ypres salient, had a specific geological character. It was dense and waterlogged, sitting on top of a layer of clay that did not drain, and when it was churned by shell fire, it became something close to quicksand in places. Men who stepped off the duckboards that lined the trench floors, especially at night, could sink to their knees immediately. If they struggled, they sank further. There are documented cases of men drowning in mud, unable to extract themselves, unable to be extracted by others before the mud took them. This was not a rare or unusual occurrence. It was sufficiently common that soldiers developed specific techniques for moving through heavily shelled ground, specific ways of testing the ground ahead with a rifle butt or a stick, specific protocols for what to do if a man went in and could not get out. The mud destroyed equipment at a rate that supply chains struggled to match. It destroyed boots, which was a serious military problem because foot conditions caused by wet and cold were a significant source of casualties. It destroyed rifles, clogging mechanisms so that in the moments when a rifle was most needed, it would not fire. It destroyed the trenches themselves, which had to be constantly rebuilt and shored up, an endless labor that fell to the men regardless of what else they had to do that day. The labor of maintaining the trenches was one of the defining features of trench life that is least represented in popular accounts. Men who were not in the line were often working, carrying supplies, digging new positions, repairing old ones, laying wire, filling sandbags. Sleep was something that happened in fragments, in dugouts that were often wet, often cold, often shared with rats. The mud was always there when they woke up. The rats are worth addressing directly because they appear in virtually every account of trench life, and because the reality of them was considerably worse than the way they tend to be described. The trenches created an ideal environment for rat populations. There was food waste, human waste, the bodies of the dead, both in no man's land and occasionally in the trench itself, if a man had been killed in place and could not immediately be moved. The rats that thrived in this environment were large, well-fed animals. Soldiers described them as being the size of cats, which was not always an exaggeration. They moved through the dugouts at night and ate whatever was available, including food that men had set aside for the next day, including leather equipment, including, most disturbingly, the faces and hands of the dead. This last fact was documented repeatedly and is not a matter of speculation. The rats were opportunistic feeders, and they fed on what was available. Men who were wounded and could not move were in genuine danger from rats in some sections of the line. The psychological effect of living in close proximity to this many large rats, of hearing them at night, of waking to find them on your blanket, of watching them move with complete indifference through spaces you were trying to inhabit, was cumulative and difficult to quantify but clearly significant. Soldiers developed methods of killing rats, including bayonets, and improvised traps and small terrier dogs that were sometimes kept in the trenches for exactly this purpose. The dogs were popular. They served the practical function of rat control and the psychological function of providing something warm and unambiguously alive in an environment where those qualities had become rare. But no number of dogs made a significant dent in the rat population, which simply kept pace with whatever conditions created it. Lice were perhaps the most universally shared experience of the entire war. Almost every man who served in the trenches for any length of time had lice, and the condition was so ubiquitous that it had acquired a soldier's slang name, chatting, referring to the process of going through the seams of clothing to find and crush the eggs. This was done as a matter of routine during rest periods, the way a man might clean his kit or write a letter, just something you did because if you did not do it, the infestation became worse. The lice lived in the seams of shirts and underclothing and caused constant itching, particularly at night and in the warmth of dugouts. They could not be fully eliminated by any means available to a soldier in the field. Delousing stations existed behind the lines where clothing could be treated. But men returned to the trenches and were reinfested almost immediately. The medical consequences of lice went beyond discomfort. Lice were the vector for trench fever, a disease caused by the bacterium Bartonella quintana, which produces high fever, severe leg pain, and debilitating weakness, and which can recur for months or years after initial infection. It is estimated that trench fever accounted for approximately 15% of all reported illness in the British forces alone. The disease was not identified and its louse vector not confirmed until 1918, near the end of the war, which meant that for most of the conflict, men suffering from it were sometimes returned to duty before they had recovered, or were listed under vague categories that obscured the true scale of the problem. The institutional response to lice was essentially one of management rather than elimination. Lice were treated as a condition of service, something to be minimized where possible and otherwise endured. The men endured it. The relationship between soldiers and their own bodies changed in ways that had no civilian equivalent. In civilian life, bodily integrity is largely assumed. You move through the world in a body that functions, that you can trust to carry you from one moment to the next, that responds more or less predictably to your intentions. The trenches systematically dismantled this assumption. The bodies of frontline soldiers were subjected to constant low-level damage even when they were not involved in direct combat. The wet and cold produced trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and cold in which the tissues of the foot begin to break down, the blood vessels constrict and then dilate, and in serious cases the flesh begins to die. Trench foot in mild cases is extremely painful and temporarily disabling. In severe cases, it results in gangrene and amputation. The British Army attempted to combat trench foot with a system of whale oil application, whereby NCOs were supposed to ensure that the men rubbed whale oil into their feet regularly to preserve the skin's integrity. This system was implemented with varying degrees of rigor, depending on the unit and the conditions, and records of foot inspections were kept as a matter of official policy, meaning that a commanding officer whose men developed significant trench foot could expect to have questions asked about his supervisory practices. This created a situation in which the suffering of soldiers' feet had been bureaucratized, incorporated into a system of reports and inspections and accountability that existed on paper alongside the actual physical experience of the men involved. The gap between the paper and the experience was one of the defining features of the administrative reality of the war. Hunger was a constant companion for many soldiers, though it manifested differently depending on rank, position, and the competence of local logistics. The official ration scale for British soldiers was theoretically adequate in calories, but the actual food that reached the front line was frequently not the official ration. It had been reduced in transit, delayed, contaminated, or simply was not what it was supposed to be. Bully beef, which was canned corned beef, and hardtack biscuits were the staples of the front line, supplemented when possible by tea and occasionally by bread or jam. The bread arrived stale when it arrived at all. The jam, which soldiers referred to by brand names with a weariness that suggested long familiarity, was usually plum and apple, which was the cheapest and most abundant variety, and which became an object of profound weariness among men who had eaten little else for weeks at a time. Hot food was available in rest periods, and sometimes at the rear of the support trench, but getting hot food to men in the front line was logistically difficult under any conditions and impossible under heavy fire. Men learned to heat their own food using small portable cookers that burned solidified alcohol or scraps of wood when available. But these produced limited heat and were a fire risk in a confined space. The caloric deficit experienced by many frontline soldiers was real and had measurable effects on physical performance and psychological resilience. Men who were hungry were also more susceptible to cold, to infection, to the kind of mental fatigue that made rational decision-making difficult. The official records do not capture hunger directly. They capture efficiency. The gap between those two measures of the same reality is instructive. The noise of the Western Front was something that men described with an almost desperate effort to convey its scale, and which most civilians at home could not genuinely imagine despite the attempts. The artillery barrages that preceded major offensives were audible in southern England. which gives some sense of the decibels involved at close range. A man in a forward trench during a heavy bombardment was subjected to a sustained physical assault by sound. The concussive force of shells bursting nearby was not just auditory but bodily. Men felt it in their chests, their sinuses, their teeth. The ground itself moved. Shells of sufficient caliber, and the war saw calibers that had no precedent, created craters large enough to hold a small house and sent fragments of metal and stone in all directions at velocities that made conventional cover largely meaningless. The psychological effect of sustained bombardment was clinically recognized during the war, though the recognition was incomplete and inconsistent, and what happened to men under sustained shellfire was the subject of significant institutional controversy. Shell shock was the popular term, one that soldiers and civilians alike used to describe the range of symptoms produced in men by exposure to heavy artillery. Those symptoms included tremor, inability to speak, inability to hear despite no physical damage to the ears, paralysis of limbs with no corresponding physical injury, violent nightmares, sudden collapse, uncontrollable weeping, complete dissociation from surroundings. The military and medical response to shell shock evolved slowly and painfully across the 4 years of the war, driven by the sheer scale of cases and by the growing impossibility of pretending that the men affected were simply cowards or malingerers. The official position at the start of the war, and the position that persisted in some quarters throughout it, was that the symptoms of shell shock indicated moral weakness rather than physical or psychological injury. This position was convenient for several reasons, the most obvious being that recognizing shell shock as a genuine medical condition created entitlements for treatment, for pension, for discharge, that the system was not designed to accommodate at the scale required. The alternative interpretation, that the symptoms were caused by concussive damage to the nervous system or by the psychological consequences of sustained exposure to extreme stress, was argued by a number of military physicians, some of whom became significant figures in the history of trauma medicine. WHR. Rivers, working at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland, developed an approach to treating shell shock patients that was based on the emerging principles of psychoanalysis and on his own understanding of the relationship between memory, trauma, and psychological function. His patients included Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, both of whom left records of their experience that illuminate the institutional reality of shell shock treatment in ways that official records do not. But Rivers and the approaches he represented were not the norm. The norm was a spectrum of responses that ranged from genuine, if limited, medical care to straightforward punitive treatment of men whose symptoms were interpreted as a disciplinary problem. The spectrum included electric shock therapy, administered not as a medical treatment, but as a coercive one, intended to make the symptoms more uncomfortable to maintain than to abandon. It included men being returned to frontline duty while still symptomatic, on the theory that the best treatment for the effects of the trenches was re-exposure to the trenches. It included men being shot for cowardice and desertion when the behaviors that led to those charges were the direct product of psychological collapse. 306 British soldiers were executed for military offences during the war. The relationship between those executions and the psychological conditions that the war had produced was not examined at the time and was actively suppressed afterward. Death in the trenches was a specific thing with specific qualities that were entirely unlike the death that men had encountered in civilian life or had imagined from literature or from the previous century's more distant wars. Men died in ways that were intimate and visible. They died next to men they knew, sometimes instantaneously, sometimes over hours or days. They died from fragments of metal that entered the body in places and at angles that defied any expectation. A man could be killed by a splinter the size of a fingernail entering the base of his skull, while his body remained entirely intact from the neck down, so that the initial appearance was of a man who had simply sat down or fallen asleep. A man could survive a wound that destroyed a limb and then die of infection 3 weeks later in a hospital behind the lines. A man could be killed by the concussive force of a shell that did not touch him, the overpressure rupturing organs internally, leaving no visible mark. Sniper fire was a constant hazard in static trench warfare, and the specific geography of sniping, the small hole in the parapet, the line of sight across no man's land, the fraction of a second between exposure and impact, shaped the physical behavior of men in the front line in ways that became automatic. Men moved in certain ways and not others. They did not raise their heads above the parapet at dawn, which was when visibility was best and snipers were most active. They moved through communication trenches at a crouch, even when height made it unnecessary. They learned the specific dangers of each section of the line they occupied. The salient that was enfiladed from the right, the section of trench where the revetting had collapsed and movement was exposed, the stretch near the ruined farm where the German snipers had established a particularly effective position. This knowledge was local and specific and was transmitted from unit to unit during reliefs, passed on as a matter of practical survival. The reliefs themselves were significant events in the rhythm of trench life. Units rotated through a cycle of frontline service, support positions and rest that varied by formation and by the intensity of the sector. In a quiet sector, a unit might spend 5 or 6 days in the front line, then move back to support positions for a similar period, then to rest billets further behind the line. In an active sector, or during a major offensive, this pattern broke down entirely, and men could be in the front line continuously for weeks. The rest periods were not simply time off. They involved training, working parties, inspections, and the various administrative requirements that the army maintained, regardless of circumstances. But they also involved genuine recovery, sleep in something approaching a bed, food that was more than cold rations, the ability to move in the open without constant awareness of exposure. The psychological value of this alternation was real, and the system was designed, at least in part, around the recognition that men could not remain in the front line indefinitely without breaking. What the system was not designed to accommodate was the cumulative effect of repeated cycles, the way that each return to the front line began from a slightly lower baseline, the way that men who had been through multiple major engagements carried a weight that rest billets could not fully address. The cumulative psychological damage of extended service was visible to anyone who looked, but looking at it officially created problems that the institution was not structured to solve. The relationship between officers and men was one of the defining social features of the war, and it was more complicated than either the official narrative or the counter-narrative acknowledges. The official story emphasized class harmony in adversity, the officer leading his men with paternal care, the men following with loyalty and trust, the whole forming a kind of cross-class community that the war had forged. The counter-narrative, which emerged in some of the war literature of the 1920s and 1930s, emphasized class antagonism, the callousness of officers toward the men under their command, the contempt that flowed downward through the hierarchy. The reality was more varied and more specific than either account suggests. There were officers who were genuinely concerned with the welfare of their men and who spent their authority protecting them from unnecessary exposure and unnecessary labor. There were officers who were contemptuous, who treated their men as instruments rather than as people, who applied regulations with a rigidity that served no military purpose and caused real harm. There were officers who were frightened and did their best to conceal it, who maintained the performance of command because the alternative was a collapse that would destroy the unit. The men, for their part, developed extremely fine-grained assessments of the officers above them. They knew which officers could be trusted and which could not. They knew which officers would lead from the front and which would find reasons to stay behind. They knew which officers' orders made tactical sense and which reflected ignorance or indifference. This knowledge was not expressed openly, because the formal hierarchy of military discipline made direct expression of such judgments dangerous, but it shaped behavior constantly. Units with officers who were trusted by their men performed differently from units where trust had broken down, and the difference was visible in the official records, in casualty rates, in the frequency of disciplinary incidents, in the nature of the court-martial records, though the official records never named what they were recording. The military justice system of the First World War was an extension of the administrative machinery of the war and shared its fundamental character. It was designed to maintain order and cohesion in a force of millions of men under conditions that placed enormous pressure on both. The punishments available to military courts ranged from relatively minor field punishments to death, and the gap between those extremes was filled with a range of intermediate measures that could be applied with considerable discretion. Field punishment number 1, which involved a man being tied to a fixed object, often a wheel or a post, for up to 2 hours a day for up to 21 days, was one of the most commonly applied serious punishments and was widely referred to in soldiers' slang as crucifixion, a term that speaks clearly to how it was perceived by the men. It was applied for offenses ranging from insubordination to petty theft to absence without leave, and it was administered in the field, often within sight or earshot of other men in the unit, which was part of its deterrent purpose. The visibility of punishment was itself a feature of the system, not an accident. Courts-martial for more serious offenses were conducted with a procedural formality that bore little relationship to the circumstances in which soldiers were required to make the decisions that led to their being charged. A man charged with cowardice in the face of the enemy was tried by a panel of officers who applied a legal standard derived from peacetime military law to a decision that had been made in a front-line trench under shellfire at 2 in the morning by a man who had not slept in 30 hours. The procedural record of the trial might show a proper process. The human reality of what had actually happened was largely invisible to that process, and the process was not designed to see it. The question of what constituted cowardice and the related questions of desertion and self-inflicted wounds were among the most institutionally sensitive aspects of the war's administration. The Army's position was that cowardice and desertion were voluntary acts, the products of individual moral failure, and that they needed to be deterred by the possibility of severe punishment, up to and including death. The medical and psychological evidence that was accumulating throughout the war pointed toward a different understanding, one in which many of the behaviors classified as cowardice or desertion were the direct consequence of the psychological damage that the war was inflicting on the men it employed. The tension between these two understandings was never fully resolved during the war and was actively suppressed afterward. The number of men who were executed for cowardice and desertion was known, but the individual case files were classified for decades. When they were eventually examined, what they revealed was a system in which the quality of legal representation was inconsistent, in which the mitigating factor of psychological injury was sometimes acknowledged and often ignored, in which the confirmation of death sentences by senior commanders was sometimes cursory and was shaped by considerations that had nothing to do with the justice of the individual case. The broader point is not simply that injustice was done to specific individuals, though it was. The broader point is that the system of military justice was designed to serve the operational requirements of the war, and that in serving those requirements it processed men through procedures that treated their psychological states as legally irrelevant. Gas warfare was introduced to the Western Front in April 1915 when the German army released approximately 168 tons of chlorine gas at Ypres, creating a cloud that drifted toward the French and Algerian troops holding that section of the line. The immediate tactical success of the attack was not fully exploited, partly because the German commanders had not anticipated the scale of the effect and had not prepared adequate reserves to advance through the gap. But the weapon had been demonstrated, and all of the major powers rapidly developed both gas weapons and countermeasures. The progression of chemical weapons during the war represents a specific kind of institutional horror, the systematic development of methods of causing suffering that were calibrated to defeat the protective measures that the previous method had made necessary. Chlorine was countered by wet cloths pressed to the face, then by primitive respirators, then by better respirators. Phosgene, which was colorless and smelled faintly of cut hay, was more toxic than chlorine and harder to detect in time to allow protective measures. Mustard gas, introduced in 1917, was not primarily a killing agent. It was a blister agent designed to incapacitate rather than to kill, because an incapacitated man required resources to treat and evacuate, while a dead man required only burial. Mustard gas settled on surfaces, contaminated equipment and clothing, caused blistering of the skin, particularly in warm and moist areas of the body, caused severe eye damage and temporary or permanent blindness, and caused internal blistering if inhaled. It persisted in the soil for days and could be reactivated by disturbance. Men who walked through mustard-contaminated ground and then touched their faces or removed their boots without knowing what they were walking through could be seriously injured hours after the initial exposure, long after they believed the danger had passed. The casualty figures from gas during the war are significant but are not the full measure of the weapon's effect. The psychological consequence of the possibility of gas, the requirement to carry and maintain a respirator at all times, the drill of rapid donning that was practiced until it became automatic, the particular anxiety of a wind change or an unfamiliar smell, these were not captured in casualty statistics but were part of the constant low-level stress that defined frontline existence. The stretcher-bearers occupied a specific and particularly terrible position in the ecology of the front line. They were the men, usually 4 to a stretcher team, responsible for removing the wounded from the places where they had fallen, which often meant going into no man's land under fire, or navigating through the complex geography of the trench system, carrying a loaded stretcher through conditions that would have been difficult to navigate unburdened. Stretcher-bearers were theoretically protected under the Geneva Convention and were supposed to be marked with the Red Cross. In practice, the practical and visual limitations of frontline combat made this distinction difficult to maintain, and stretcher-bearers were killed in large numbers. The work was physically exhausting to a degree that is hard to overstate. A loaded stretcher in dry conditions on flat ground weighs approximately 250 pounds by the time the weight of the casualty, the stretcher itself, and the equipment of 4 bearers is taken into account. In the conditions of the Western Front, which typically involved deep mud, cratered ground, darkness, and the constant necessity of moving at a crouch to avoid fire, the physical demands were immense. Men doing this work for extended periods developed musculoskeletal injuries that were not recognized as injuries because the army did not have a category for them. The psychological demands were equally significant. Stretcher-bearers worked in close proximity to the worst wounds the war could produce. They handled men in extremis. They made constant decisions about who could be moved and who could not, about which cases were urgent and which were not, about what to do when the capacity to treat exceeded the number who could be treated. These decisions were made in the dark, under fire, in conditions of extreme physical stress, and they were made by men who had no special preparation for making them, and no institutional support for their consequences. The field hospitals and casualty clearing stations that received the wounded from the front represented a different kind of institutional reality, one shaped by the overwhelming volume of casualties and by the medical technology available to treat them. The scale of the wounds produced by modern artillery and machine gun fire exceeded anything that military medicine had previously encountered, and the medical services of all the major powers were improvising responses to a casualty load that their pre-war planning had not anticipated. The triage system, which sorted casualties into those who would survive without treatment, those who would survive with treatment, those who would not survive regardless of treatment, and those whose survival depended on immediate intervention, was applied with a consistency and a coldness that was necessary to the functioning of the system, and that was deeply disturbing to the individuals who had to apply it. A man who had been carried out of the line by stretcher-bearers, who had survived the journey to the casualty clearing station, could be assessed by a medical officer in 30 seconds and assigned to the category of those who were unlikely to survive regardless of the resources applied, and then left in a separate area to die. This was not cruelty. It was a rational response to a situation in which resources were finite, and the demand on them was essentially unlimited. The men who made these decisions, and the men who carried them out, understood their necessity. Understanding necessity does not eliminate its cost. Infection was the second war that soldiers fought, less visible than the first, but no less deadly. The medical advances of the late 19th century had given physicians an understanding of bacterial infection and its mechanisms, but the tools available to combat infection in 1914 were limited. The antiseptics available were effective in laboratory conditions and considerably less effective in the conditions of forward surgical units. The wounds produced by artillery fire, which drove fragments of shell casing, rock, wood, and clothing into the body at high velocity, were inherently contaminated. The soil of the Western Front, which had been heavily fertilized for agriculture over many centuries and which contained correspondingly high concentrations of bacterial organisms, including the anaerobic bacteria responsible for gas gangrene and tetanus, was driven into wounds along with everything else. Gas gangrene, caused by Clostridium perfringens, was one of the defining medical catastrophes of the war. It is a condition in which anaerobic bacteria multiply rapidly in damaged tissue, producing gas as a metabolic byproduct, destroying muscle and connective tissue at a rate that could progress from a wound in a limb to a systemic fatal infection within hours if not treated. The treatment was amputation, and the amputation had to be performed proximal to the infection, meaning that a gangrene case in the forearm might require amputation at the shoulder. The sound and smell of a gas gangrene case, which were both distinctive and unmistakable, were known to every nurse and orderly who worked in the forward medical facilities, and they appear in accounts of hospital service with the same flat matter-of-factness that characterizes all descriptions of conditions that had been absorbed into the routine. The medical system's relationship to psychological casualties evolved throughout the war under the pressure of sheer numbers. By 1917, shell shock and related conditions accounted for a significant and embarrassing proportion of the hospital beds behind the Western Front. The embarrassing quality was not incidental. The condition challenged the institutional narrative of the war, which required that the symptoms be voluntary. Because if they were involuntary, if they were the direct product of conditions that the army created and maintained, then the army's moral position became considerably more complex. The neurologist Charles Myers, who served as a British Army medical officer and who was one of the first clinicians to use the term shell shock in a professional context, found himself increasingly at odds with the military authorities over the question of how the condition should be classified and treated. His recommendations, which involved removing men from the front line, providing rest and limited psychological treatment, and returning them to non-combat duties rather than directly to the front, were resisted on the grounds that they encouraged the spread of the condition and rewarded what the military hierarchy preferred to classify as weakness. The official position hardened as casualty rates increased and the manpower situation became more critical. The need for bodies in the trenches made the recognition of psychological injury as a medical entitlement increasingly inconvenient, and the system responded to this inconvenience in the way that institutions generally do, by adjusting the categories through which it processed reality rather than by confronting the reality itself. The food supply to the front was one of the logistical achievements of the war, and the achievement was real and significant. Feeding millions of men in the field, maintaining supply lines under constant artillery interdiction, adapting to the disruption of major offensives, these were genuine organizational accomplishments. But the achievement existed at a distance from the experience of men in the forward trenches, where the accomplishment of the supply system resolved itself into cold bully beef and wet biscuits eaten in a dugout with rats moving in the shadows. The distance between the official performance of logistics and the actual experience of eating is one of the smaller illustrations of a larger principle, that the war was administered in categories that were designed to make the administration possible, and that those categories necessarily simplified, omitted, and sometimes falsified the human reality they described. The ration system recorded weights and calories. It did not record the fact that men under extreme stress lose appetite entirely for periods and then eat compulsively, or that food eaten cold in a wet dugout after a night patrol has a different relationship to the human body than food eaten in the conditions the ration tables assumed, or that the social and psychological dimensions of eating, its role in providing a sense of normality and connection to life before the war, were being progressively destroyed by the conditions in which it had to take place. The relationship to time in the trenches was one of the least discussed but most pervasive aspects of the experience. Civilian time, the time of schedules and plans and the future, became largely meaningless in the front line, where the immediate present was the only temporal category that reliably existed. Men who had entered the war with careers planned, with marriages anticipated, with a sense of a life unfolding in a predictable direction, discovered that the frame in which those plans had made sense had dissolved. The future was the next hour, the next stand-to, the next night patrol. Planning beyond that horizon was a form of psychological risk that most men learned, consciously or not, to avoid. This compression of temporal awareness was an adaptation, a way of surviving in a present that contained so much immediate demand that there was simply no cognitive capacity available for the future. But it was also a form of damage, because it dismantled the psychological infrastructure through which people make meaning. The men who came back from the war after it ended, and who were expected to simply resume the futures they had interrupted in 1914 or 1915 or 1916, found that the capacity for the kind of forward-looking orientation that civilian life required had been significantly altered by years of living entirely in the present under extreme stress. The systems that existed to support their return, and there were such systems, medical and social and financial, were designed for men who were physically injured or physically ill. They were not designed for men who had been changed in ways that were difficult to name or to demonstrate, but that were real, and that did not resolve on their own with the passage of time. The letters that soldiers wrote home, and the letters that they received from home, were shaped by a dual censorship. The official military censorship that screened outgoing correspondence, and the internal self-censorship that most men applied to what they said to their families. The official censorship was concerned primarily with operational security, with preventing information about unit positions, movements, and casualties from reaching the enemy. It was applied by officers who read the letters of the men under their command, which created its own particular intimacy and its own particular constraint. Men who wanted to describe what they were actually experiencing knew that what they wrote would be read by someone in their chain of command, and that what they said might reflect on them and might affect how they were perceived and treated. The internal self-censorship was in some ways more significant. Most men who wrote home made conscious choices to omit the worst of what they were experiencing, to spare their families the specific horrors, to maintain the performance of resilience that the people who loved them needed them to maintain. The letters that survive from the front are striking for what they do not say. They mention the cold and the mud and the wait, and the occasional good meal, and the mail that was late, or the parcel that was appreciated. They mention friends by name, sharing small incidents of humor or fellowship. They do not mention the man who died in the next fire bay, or the way a shell sounds when it is going to land close. The gap between what was written and what was experienced is one of the most significant archival features of the war. The correspondence in the other direction, from home to the front, created its own particular pressures. Letters from home described a world that was recognizable but increasingly remote. A world of domestic rhythms and social routines and small concerns that had no relationship to the world of the trenches. Some of the men found this comforting, the proof that something ordinary still existed somewhere. Others found it widening an already significant gap, the sense that the world they had come from was becoming unintelligible to them or they to it, that the common language of civilian life was losing its meaning as the war took them further from it. The specific emotional experience of homesickness under these conditions is distinct from the civilian version. It was not simply longing for a familiar place. It was something closer to grief for a version of oneself and one's world that had ceased to exist and might not be recoverable. The question of what officers and men were told about the strategic situation is one that the official record addresses with considerable evasion. The men in the trenches generally received very little information about the broader military situation, about the reasoning behind the specific operations they were asked to perform, about whether their particular piece of line was considered critical or secondary or simply a holding position in a larger calculation. The operational security rationale for limiting information was real, but was also convenient. Men who understood why they were being asked to attack across a particular piece of ground, and who had the information necessary to evaluate the quality of the planning behind that attack, might have asked questions that the chain of command did not want asked. The result was that men went over the top into situations they did not fully understand, as part of plans whose logic was opaque to them, suffering casualties that they could not evaluate against any larger purpose, because the larger purpose was not something they had been given the information to assess. This informational isolation was not uniform. Some officers shared what they knew with the men under their command. Some maintained a deliberate opacity on the theory that uncertainty was less demoralizing than the truth. But the structural tendency of the institution was toward the management of information in ways that served the institution's operational needs, and the operational needs of the institution frequently did not align with the epistemic interests of the men who were required to execute its operations. The major Allied offensives of the war represent the most visible and most documented form of the institutional logic of attrition. The strategy that accepted mass casualties on one's own side as the necessary price of inflicting mass casualties on the other. The Somme offensive, which began on the 1st of July 1916, produced 57,470 British casualties on its first day, including 19,240 dead. These numbers are well known and have been repeated many times, but their familiarity should not be allowed to obscure what they represent in human terms. They represent 57,470 instances of a person being hit by metal moving at high velocity, or by the pressure wave of an explosion, or by chemical burns, or by gas. They represent 19,240 instances of a person dying in the specific ways that people die from these causes on a single summer day in northern France, before noon in many cases, in the time between a whistle blowing and the German machine guns establishing their fields of fire across no man's land. The planning that preceded this day had been extensive and careful by the standards of 1916. The artillery bombardment that was supposed to destroy the German wire and the German forward positions had lasted 7 days and had fired over 1.5 million shells. The failure of that bombardment to achieve its objectives, due partly to the proportion of shells that were duds and partly to the depth of the German dugouts, which had been constructed to survive exactly this kind of bombardment, was known to some of the planners before the attack began and was not communicated to the men who were going forward. The attack proceeded on a timeline and a plan that the information available to the planners should have caused to be reconsidered. The information was not acted on in the ways it should have been, and the reasons for this reflect the institutional dynamics of a military organization under extreme pressure. The difficulty of revising plans at the last moment, the investment in a particular course of action that makes acknowledging its flaws extremely costly, the hierarchy of authority that concentrates decision-making at levels where the specific human consequences of those decisions are most remote. The Passchendaele offensive, fought in the Ypres salient between July and November 1917, became in many ways the defining image of the war's capacity for self-defeating persistence. The tactical objective was to push the German forces back from the high ground around Ypres and, in the longer-term plan, to threaten the German-held Belgian coast. The conditions in which the battle was fought were catastrophic. The drainage of the low-lying ground around Ypres had been destroyed by years of artillery fire. When the preliminary bombardment for the offensive further broke up the already damaged soil and the rain that characterized the autumn of 1917 arrived, the battlefield became the closest approximation to the popular image of Western Front mud that the entire war produced. Men, horses, and equipment disappeared into the mud. Wounded men who fell into the shell craters filled with water drowned. The advance, such as it was measured in hundreds of yards per week at a cost of thousands of lives. The official records of the battle show a series of limited tactical gains. They do not show the experience of advancing through that ground, of the specific sensory and physical reality of what the commanders who remained behind the line had decided was an acceptable condition for the prosecution of their objectives. The British commander, Douglas Haig, maintained throughout the battle, and afterward in his dispatches and his diary, a version of events in which the offensive was proceeding according to plan, and in which the costs were justified by the damage being inflicted on the German forces. The evidence for the damage being inflicted on the German forces was, by late 1917, considerably more qualified than his dispatches suggested. The evidence of what was being done to the British and Commonwealth forces was in the casualty returns that crossed his desk every day. The colonial dimension of the war is one of the most consistently underrepresented aspects of its history. The armies of the major powers were not composed entirely of men from the metropolitan countries. The British Army included substantial contingents from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the West Indies, and various African territories. The French Army included men from Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, Madagascar, and Indochina. The relationship between these men and the institutions that deployed them was shaped by the colonial assumptions of the time, which included hierarchies of military value that placed some contingents above others based on theories of racial character that were widely accepted in official and unofficial culture. Indian soldiers, who made up a significant proportion of the British forces on the Western Front in 1914 and 1915, were replaced by British and Dominion troops, partly on military grounds, and partly because there were concerns in the British command about the effect of the Western Front conditions on Indian morale, concerns that reflected assumptions about the relative resilience of different racial groups that were embedded in the institutional thinking of the time. The Senegalese troops in the French army, the tirailleurs sénégalais, were used in attack roles that carried disproportionately high casualties, assigned to these roles partly on the theory that their fighting qualities made them especially effective in offensive operations, and partly because the French command was more willing to accept casualties among colonial troops than among metropolitan French. The official records of the war do not generally state these calculations explicitly. They are visible in the casualty rates, in the distribution of roles, in the specific language used in official correspondence when colonial troops are discussed. The handling of the dead was one of the administrative problems for which the war had no adequate precedent. The scale of casualties exceeded the capacity of any system designed to track, identify, and bury individuals in a way that would allow notification of families. The graves registration units, which were responsible for the location and recording of bodies, worked under conditions that made systematic identification often impossible. Bodies that had been in the ground for months or that had been repeatedly disturbed by shellfire were often unidentifiable. The official categories for the missing, which eventually numbered in the hundreds of thousands on all sides, represented men whose deaths were essentially certain, but whose remains had not been found or had been found but could not be identified. The families of the missing occupied a specifically painful position in the war's civilian dimension. They knew that their son or husband or brother was almost certainly dead, but had no confirmation, no grave, no specific location to which grief could be addressed. The official process for establishing death in these cases required a formal waiting period and a bureaucratic procedure that imposed a specific temporal structure on grief. Letters from the War Office informing families that a man had been posted as missing, and then as missing, believed killed, and then as officially presumed dead, were among the artifacts that the war produced in the largest quantities, and that carried the most precise institutional character in the face of the most personal possible loss. The armistice that ended the fighting on November 11, 1918, was announced at a specific time, 11 in the morning, because the negotiating parties had agreed on 11 o'clock as the hour at which the ceasefire would take effect. This meant that the war continued to claim casualties on the morning of November 11th, right up to the moment it stopped. Commanders who knew the armistice was coming, who knew that the killing would stop at 11, made decisions about operations in the hours before 11 that resulted in men being killed at 9 and 10 and 7 minutes before 11. The casualty figures for November 11, 1918 are higher than for an average day on the Western Front in a quiet period. The precise reasons why individual commanders continued operations on the morning of the last day of the war vary, but the pattern is clear. Some continued because the orders they had been given required them to continue until specifically countermanded. Some continued because the war had created institutional momentum that did not stop easily. Some continued because the logic of the war had become sufficiently self-enclosed that the pending end of it did not register as a reason to change behavior that had been the same for 4 years. The last British soldier to die in the First World War was George Ellison, killed near Mons at approximately 9:30 on the morning of November 11th. The last American soldier to die was Henry Gunther, killed at 10:59, 1 minute before the armistice. He had been reduced in rank for writing a letter home that expressed negative sentiments about the war, and had been trying to recover his reputation by leading a charge against a German machine gun position. He was waved away by the German soldiers manning the position, who knew the war was 90 seconds from being over. He kept coming. They fired. The armistice took effect. The war ended. The dead remained dead, in the same numbers they would have been in if the morning of November 11th had been treated as a morning on which the killing could have stopped before 11. The immediate aftermath of the armistice revealed something about the war that its 4-year duration had partially concealed. The institutions that had generated and sustained it did not stop when the fighting stopped. They continued to process men through administrative procedures, to impose discipline, to maintain hierarchies, to produce paper. The demobilization of the British Army was conducted on principles that prioritized the economic stability of key industries over the length of service and the suffering of individual soldiers, meaning that men who had been in the army longest were not necessarily demobilized first. This produced serious unrest in some units and camps, including mutinies that were suppressed with varying degrees of force and that were subsequently minimized in official accounts. The men who had spent 4 years in the army learning to subordinate every personal consideration to institutional requirements found that the institution's consideration for them was calibrated to economic and political requirements that had nothing to do with them as individuals. This was not surprising, given what they had already learned about how institutions operated, but it was the final lesson in a long course of instruction. The pension and disability system that was established to support veterans of the war was constructed on principles that required men to prove their injuries in categories and through procedures that the system determined. Psychological injury was recognized only in the most severe and demonstrable cases. The cumulative damage of years of chronic stress, of repeated exposure to extreme violence, of the specific alterations in psychology and nervous function that extended combat service produced, was not recognized in a way that generated entitlement. Men who returned from the war with nightmares and tremors and an inability to sustain the ordinary social relationships of civilian life found that these conditions were not, in the official view, injuries. They were weaknesses, or they were the results of civilian misfortune, or they were simply the character of the man in question. The pension tribunals that assessed disability claims applied medical and legal standards that had been developed in a world that did not include the Western Front, and they applied them to men whose conditions that world could not fully accommodate. The results were predictable and were predicted by the people who understood what the war had actually done to the men who fought it. The official records show the percentages awarded and denied. They do not show the faces in the waiting rooms or the letters that were never written, because the men who might have written them had lost the capacity to do it. The influenza pandemic that killed more people globally than the war itself, with estimates ranging from 50 to 100 million deaths between 1918 and 1919, arrived in the final months of the conflict and accelerated through populations whose immune systems and general health had been degraded by 4 years of inadequate nutrition, exposure, and chronic stress. The military populations on all sides were among the most severely affected, with influenza sweeping through camps and billets with a speed and a lethality that the medical services could not respond to effectively. The pandemic overlapped with the final months of the war and with the beginning of demobilization, and it moved with the men as they traveled home, carried on ships and trains across the networks that the war had connected and that it was now dissolving. The relationship between the war and the pandemic is direct. The conditions the war created, the concentration of weakened populations, the movement of people across continents, the destruction of the public health infrastructure in affected areas, these were among the factors that shaped the pandemic's spread and severity. The pandemic is generally treated as a separate historical event from the war. The men who experienced both knew differently. The memorials that were built in the years after the war represent the official culture's attempt to give the dead the meaning that the war had consumed. They are among the largest and most impressive works of public architecture of the 20th century. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme, designed by Edwin Lutyens, is inscribed with the names of 72,195 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme between 1915 and 1918 and who have no known grave. The Menin Gate at Ypres is inscribed with the names of 54,196 men of the Commonwealth forces who died in the Ypres salient and whose bodies were never found. These structures are designed to hold and to present grief, to give the scale of the loss a form that can be approached and experienced. They are in their way successful. They are also in a way that their designers understood and that the people who visit them also understand, if they allow themselves to, inadequate. The names are inscribed in stone. The lives that ended were not inscribed in stone. They were specific and particular, and they ended in specific and particular ways that the inscriptions do not record, and that the memorials cannot hold. The war that produced the names on those walls was not a war of sacrifice in the sense that the official culture of commemoration requires. It was a war of administration, of logistics, of industrial-scale production and consumption of human lives by an institutional system that did not experience the lives it consumed as individual and irreplaceable, because if it had, it could not have consumed them in the way it did. The names remain on the walls. The system that produced them remains, in its essential character, intact.